welcome to part 2 of the video series. I'm going to start by briefly discussing what race and color are versus what your ethnicity, nationality, and cultural group are. Very simple and quick. Then I'm going to speak about the classifications and terminology for so-called mixed race people in the US versus their classification in North Africa and the so-called Middle East, while simultaneously discussing this nonsense of there being such a thing as a white Moor or a white Arab. And there's no such thing as a white Arab. I'm gonna also dispel many of these places that supposedly mean land of the blacks, like Kemet, Bilad al-Sudan, and Guinea. So race versus ethnic group, nationality, and culture is not a difficult thing to discuss the difference between. Classifying people in a race is confusing and impossible, whereas explaining nationalities and ethnicities is very simple because it's based in reality. To put it simply, the difference is that race is an artificial construct, of course, used to brand us and group millions of people into categories based on not only superficial but artificial reasons, and it's dehumanizing. And I forgot to bring up this point that's been mentioned before about race. Race is literally a race, like running a marathon. It's a race towards the social status of whiteness. And as I've proved in part 1, even Europeans like the Irish and Italians had to participate in the race towards whiteness. Nationality, ethnicity, and cultural group are all connected and related. Nationality, of course, is your nation of birth, the country you were born in, and the nationalities of your parents and their countries of birth. A place that can actually be found on a map and has a true basis in reality, unlike race and color. People are oftentimes taught to assume that race and color are the exact same thing as ethnicity or ethnic group. And that's completely false. Race and color are artificial and social constructs and social statuses. Your ethnic group is simply your cultural group and your heritage, your history, language, religious, spiritual, or soulful practices, customs, family origins, basically the things that make you a living being and is a true identity. Making the connection between nationality and ethnic or cultural group is simple. Anybody can do it with a simple Google search. For any country, no matter which continent it's on, will usually have multiple ethnic or cultural groups within it. Just type in a certain country and Google the number and names of the ethnic groups. The continent of Africa has 54 countries, and each of those 54 countries is a nationality. You can Google ethnicities of each of those 54 countries in Africa, and according to all of the research and studying I've done, there are over 2,000 different cultural and linguistic groups spread across Africa alone. For example, the ethnic groups of Kenya include the Maasai, the Kikuyu, the Luo, the Meru, and many more. But the people who belong to these cultural groups, their nationality would be Kenyan, and their ethnicity would be Maasai, Kikuyu, and so on, depending on which culture they belong to. But also your ethnic group or your cultural group is a nation within itself. Cultural groups are nations within larger nations known as countries. China has around 56 ethnic groups. Each person's nationality would be Chinese, and their nationality will also be their cultural group, like the Han Chinese. It's simple to comprehend. And it's the same thing with the Australians and the Tasmanian Aboriginals, who also form themselves into hundreds of nations with their own languages and tribal boundaries. You can look up the map of their territorial and tribal locations. And of course we have the countless numbers of cultural groups and nations and tribes within North, Central, and South America. All of these many different nations on each continent united to form confederacies, empires that span hundreds of thousands of miles with hundreds of smaller nations and cultures within them. A good map that you can look up is a map called Alkebulan 1260, which is a representation of the many kingdoms and nations of the continent of Africa before European colonization. You know what I'm saying? Alkebulan 1260 shows that even before the continent of Africa was divided up into these modern 54 nations and countries, Africans have always seen themselves as different nations who in many cases form confederacies and kingdoms, like I said, with hundreds of different nations. You know what I'm saying? It's a pretty good map. Look it up. The concept of nationality has always existed in Africa, Asia, Australia, the Americas, so-called Europe, which really isn't a continent, but you get the point. I know many people prefer not to use the word tribe when discussing indigenous cultures, but that's what a tribe is. Tribes, clans, cultural groups, kingdoms are all nations and nationalities. Nationality is a concept that has existed since the beginning of time. The European didn't create the concept of nationality. They are the ones who created the concepts known as races and black people and colored people, though. You will see on a lot of censuses that ask what your race is. They give the options of black and white, then goes on to list things like Japanese, Chinese, Somalian, etc. First off, black and white are races and colors, social statuses, because they are artificial constructs. Everything else that is being listed, like Korean, Chinese, those are nationalities and have absolutely nothing to do with race and color at all. Those are places on a map and places of birth and origin with histories that you can actually go to. Black, African American, these are not nationalities right off the bat as well, because that is not a country. African American is referring to two continents. This is common sense. If you tell these people who perpetuate this nonsense, they will bring up these excuses like Sudan and Guinea mean black, which is I guess these people's way of trying to say that black is a nationality, I guess, somehow. And it's easy to debunk, because as soon as you look at a map of Africa, you do not see any countries that say the word black, B-L-A-C-K. You won't find it on the map anywhere. You can continue to say Bilad al Sudan and Guinea and Kemet mean land of the blacks all you want, but just give me a few minutes and I'm gonna debunk that. And then you have these people in the conscious community who want to continuously call themselves Africans when they were born in North America. Unless you were born in a country on the continent of Africa, you can never be considered an African. Unless you have a direct lineage to the continent of Africa, such as your parents, grandparents, great-grandparents who were born on the continent of Africa, who belong to specific nationalities and ethnic groups, you are not an African. I'm saying these are the most basic facts that these people fail to comprehend. Nobody who is being branded as African American can trace their lineage back to West Africa. You want to know why? Because a man by the name of Alex Haley traced his roots back to West Africa through one of his ancestors named Kunta Kinte. Come to find out, Kunta Kinte was a fictional character, as in a fake, a phony. He was imaginary, that Alex Haley plagiarized from a European named Harold Corlander, who wrote a book called The African with the exact same fictional character named Kunta Kinte. Right? Do the research. You know what I'm saying? Which, of course, was a catalyst that led to indigenous Americans taking on these false personas that they were Africans. You know what I'm saying? Alex Haley couldn't even trace his genealogy back to Africa. You know what I'm saying? But this whole DNA thing is nonsense as well. We can't be traced back to Africa because we are not Africans genetically or genealogically. In part 1, I proved to you that the European was the first one who gave you this false identity of being blacks, Negroes, and colors. I'm saying, isn't it interesting how we can pinpoint history where we started taking on these false identities? It's hilarious how all these conscious people and these RBGs forget that prior to the 1960s and James Brown, I'm Black and I'm Proud, we absolutely hated, you hear me, we hated being called black, and we prefer to be called Negroes and coloreds. Now it's the opposite. We prefer black to colored and Negro. You know what I'm saying? It's like how soon these people forget. And during the 70s, when the plagiarized work known as Roots came out, we took on the false identities of being Africans And then we started calling ourselves two continents when Jesse Jackson came up with the term African American in the 1980s. You know what I'm saying? All of these false identities, and like I explained in part one, they are to bind you to specific geographical locations. The moment you brand yourself as African, African American, or black, you have just imprisoned and binded yourself to West and Sub-Saharan African, giving up your birthright as the true indigenous or autochthonous Americans. Something that I find real funny is how many of these RBG dudes already know that they ain't blacks or Africans, like this dude Sonetta, right? On YouTube, search up a video titled Proof Sonetta is not Black African Power. In the video, this dude Sonetta says out of his own mouth that we are not Africans, and he said he ain't no fucking African. This is what he said himself. And he also said we were here before Africa. He said all this shit to Sarah Suit and Seti, yet these dudes are somehow back to being partners and friends. Sonetta knows he is not an African, and on multiple occasions he has been shown that the word black is not a true identity. He knows that he is not black or African, but he keeps up this facade as if he's down for the RBG and Pan-African movement. You know what I'm saying? He knows he's not an African or black. You know what I'm saying? They always love using these straw man arguments, and they just come to the conclusion that Moors and people who say they are indigenous Americans, these fake Africans and these RBG dudes, they say we hate being blacks and we hate being Africans. There's absolutely nothing wrong with seeing a connection between yourself and Africans. We are indigenous to all lands and we are related to all peoples. You know what I'm saying? I got nothing but love for the peoples of Africa, at least those who can show me the same respect. But at the same time, like I already said, if you were not born on any country on the continent of Africa, or you are not descended from people who can trace their lineage back to specific nationalities and cultures, you are not an African. It's as simple as that. I'm saying I don't know any so-called African American who can trace their direct lineage back to the continent of Africa. I've spoken to people who are real Africans who can actually trace their lineage there, but as far as you fake Africans in the conscious community, you are not Africans. I have confirmation from my own grandparents that our lineage can be traced back to indigenous American nations. My own mother, her mother told me this. My great-grandmother told my grandmother and my mother. I'm saying, and like I said, I'm going to speak about how DNA already says that we are indigenous Americans and how African American DNA is an absolute hoax. Alright, now I'm going to move on to the subject of classifying mixed race people. At the same time, I'm going to discuss some of these words that supposedly mean land of the blacks. Also, I'm going to speak about these so-called white Moors and white Arabs. I'm going to kill 3 birds with 1 stone. Like I mentioned a few minutes ago, when you tell these people that black is not a country or a nationality, they love bringing up these places like Bilad al-Sudan, Kemet, and Guinea, and say that these words all mean land of the blacks, right? I had a discussion with a few people and a dude named Tunji or Tuniji Legba in the comment section on YouTube. Somebody asked a question to give off some names and some nations or countries that are named black, right? This dude Tunji Legba said he told us that Guinea meant land of the blacks, and he also said that the Moors came up with the word Guinea, and that the Moors were saying that these lands were the lands of the blacks, right? Alright, so let's look at the origin of the word Guinea for a moment and its origin. I'm going to read from, page 3 of the Historical Dictionary of Guinea by Mohammed Salou Kamara, Thomas O'Toole, and Janice E. Baker. Alright, it says land and people. The origin of the name Guinea is the subject of a long-standing debate. According to a widely accepted version, the English term Guinea comes from the Portuguese Guiné, a word believed to have emerged in the mid-15th century to refer to the lands inhabited by the black African peoples below the Senegal River, known by the generic term Guineas, as opposed to the Alzenages or Moors, the lighter-skinned Zanaga Berbers found north of the region. Another version contends that the Portuguese borrowed Guineas from the Berber term Ginawan or Aginal or Akal and Ignawan, which means black or land of the blacks. Yet another account, first found in the works of Leo Africanus 1526, suggests that Guinea is derived from Genet or Digenet, the name of the historic commercial and administrative city on the upper Niger River. A final possibility is that it may have come from the Soso word Guinea for woman. Alright. Then I found another possibility to the origin of Guinea coming from geocurrents.info. It says all of the before ones that the history or the dictionary of the history of Guinea listed, and then it says a third theory holds that Guinea comes from the medieval kingdom or empire of Ghana, located in modern Mali and Mauritania. So according to these particular sources, no one truly knows the origin of the word Guinea. They say it's a possibility that the Portuguese are the ones who first came up with the word to differentiate between the darker skinned Africans and the lighter skinned Zanaga Berbers or Moors. Another possibility is that the Zanaga or Zenegay Berbers or Moors first came up with the word to differentiate between themselves and the darker skinned Africans, and the Portuguese simply borrowed a word that already existed, like Tunji Legba suggested. Another possibility is that the word Guinea comes from the name Genet or Digenet, which is a city in Mali. And one more possibility is that the word Guinea comes directly from the word Ghana. And Ghana and Guinea they do sound alike. They could possibly have the same origin and are just pronounced differently. You know what I'm saying? Sound it out. Guinea, Ghana, Ghana, Guinea. You know what I'm saying? They do sound very similar. So there's really no way of knowing if Guinea truly means land of the blacks, or even if the Moors came up with the word. The Portuguese could have just came up with the word, and it's possible that Guinea is simply just a different pronunciation of Ghana or Genet, which are indigenous words to Africa. And then I found an excellent book source that also helps to discuss the origin of the word Guinea. And it's also going to aid me in dispelling this nonsense of white Moors and white Arabs, and to discuss the terminology and classification of so-called mixed race people in Africa versus North America. I'm saying, while doing my research on the term Guinea, I came across this book called Moorings, Portuguese Expansion and the Writing of Africa, written by a man named Josiah Blackmore. You know what I'm saying? What a coincidence. You know what I'm saying? He's writing books about Moors, and his last name just happens to be Blackmore. What a coincidence. And I even found his family coat of arms for the Blackmore name. You know what I'm saying? It's crazy, ain't it? Anyway, I'm going to start off on page 11 of the book, speaking about Gomez Inez de Zerara, who was a Portuguese chronicler and explorer of Africa during the mid-1400s. Page 11. The Moor, the Guinean or Ethiopian terms that often are inconsistently applied reflect shifting encounters with Africa as the limits of the known expand. Africa and the Moro, the Negro, Guinea, or Ethiop become part of the expansionist culture that combines taxonomic observation with chronistic narrative as a foundational mode of imperial discourse. Page 23. In Zeraro's Guinea, the first European capture of African slaves occurs with the incursions of Antao Goncalves and Nuno Tristão into the Terra dos Negros, land of the blacks. Zeraro's chronicle constitutes pre-modern pro-slavery exegesis resting on the interlinking of the curse of Ham, slavery, and skin color, and attributes less worth to human beings who had black or brown skin. Yet even if race or racist thought in the modern sense did not exist in the minds of 15th and 16th century writers, there was undeniably a pre-idea of race in the 13th through 16th centuries. This presence leads Kim F. Hall to consider the symbolism and aesthetics of whiteness and blackness in early modern European culture that recognize the possibilities of this language for the representation and categorization of perceived physical differences that then become infused with ideas of Africa and African servitude. Hall counters the skittishness of some critics to use race as an operative concept in earlier periods by arguing that the easy association of race with modern science ignores the fact that race was then, as it is now, a social construct that is fundamentally more about power and culture than about biological difference. Whiteness, blackness, or in Hall's analysis, lightness, darkness, is another of those imperialist binary oppositions, or what Prestold might have early or easily designated as another conceptual category that buckle under the evidence of the early writings on Africa. These color nodes must not be understood as 2 points in opposition, but rather as a continuum, a color gradation. And it is important to note that Iberian whiteness is not necessarily English or French whiteness. The sexual unions and marriages between Portuguese and Africans during the centuries of colonization produced varied forms of whiteness, as did the unions between Iberians and Moors since the 8th century, and to invoke a white-black binary distinction is often an idealizing gesture. In race relations in the Portuguese colonial empire, C.R. Boxer notes that darkening of Portuguese whiteness in the years following the time of Zerara through intermarriages of Portuguese with Africans in Africa, a fact that blurs the boundaries between Portuguese and African. Blackness, as Lowe points out in the discussion of Zerara, proved a slippery concept for the dark-skinned Europeans who are aware of their own darkness was less than idea. Zerara's Guinea describes the new lands and populations of black Africans outside of Mauritania and Ethiopia that emerged into view as exploration, usually in the form of slaving raids, moved southward along the western shore. The chronicler combines received ideas about Africa with the second-hand reporting of newness south of Bohordor and south of the Senegal River, usually identified as the dividing line between the Terra dos Moros, land of the Moors, and the Terra dos Negros, land of the blacks. According to Horta, Guinea is a representative archive of cultural inheritance and simultaneously of the impressions resulting from first contacts. Alright, pay close attention to this right here. This is important. Zerara's terminology for natives is inconsistent. For example, Moro is alternately distinct from and synonymous with Negro, black, Moro Negro, Black Moor or Blackamoor, and Guinea or Ghanaian, and refers to the Africans outside of the generally accepted boundaries of Mauritania. Zerara's terminological inconsistency may demonstrate geographic confusion about the regions of Africa, but it also suggests that in Guinea a new kind of Moor, the Moro Negro, appears on the mental radar of the Portuguese as opposed to the northern Moor of Mauritania. De Visse and Molat incidentally observed that the classic European view of Africa and Africans and the view held by the Portuguese did not overlap, yet the latter view contained certain basic factors which the former could not ignore, namely direct contact with the hitherto unknown continent and the importation of blacks reduced to slavery. In addition to the Moro Negro, Zerara documents the existence of yet another kind of Moor, the Azenagai, modern Sanhanja, a designation that usually means the lighter-skinned Berber Moors who live on the coast as opposed to the populations living in the interior. Of interest here is Pereira's designation of two Ethiopias, Upper and Lower Ethiopia. Pereira's reiteration of this geographic divide solidifies certain notions about the distribution of Moors and the lands of the blacks for the 16th century, some of which notions originate in Zerara. Pereira's identifies Lower Ethiopia as Ethiopias de Guinea, Ethiopias of Guinea, that is, all African territories from the Senegal southward and Upper Ethiopia as the most wealthy kingdoms of India. Pereira remarks that in this region a great multitude of new peoples and black men would be found, as in fact have been discovered from the time to our day, whose color and shape and way of life none who had not seen them could believe. The insistence on the newness of the peoples of Lower Ethiopia reinscribes the idea that Guinea marks an epistemological boundary, and beyond it lies a new world, a slight relocation southward of Zerara's boundary in the form of Cape Bohordor, the end of knowledge and lore. The alliance between land divisions and skin color means that Moors, black Africans, Ethiopians, or Guineans function like monsters in that they mark geographic boundaries in the limits of the known and the familiar. Perhaps one of the most dramatic and off-sided instances of color differentiation occurs in Zararo's Guinea in what Lowe calls an unprecedented spectacle of blackness. The scene is the first documented slave market in August 1444 in the southern Portuguese town of Lagos. It was a marvelous thing to see. There were those among them of reasonable whiteness, appealing and in good form. Others were less white and appeared brown, and there were others that were as black as Ethiopians, so ugly in the face and body they appeared to those who looked on them to be the lowest hemisphere. Lahone, Black African Slaves, notes that the aesthetic judgment passed on the blackest African male here is derisive, a judgment, according to him, associated with the European fear of blackness. Yet even if we accept the negative racial evolution of blackness, it is important to note that this hierarchy is not a rigid stratification differentiating two poles of black and white, but rather a continuum. What Zararo's description of the slave market makes clear is the connectedness between black and white, so that the presumed and authoritative white I of the chronicler and of the conquistadorial we that regularly appears throughout the text, defined mostly as Christian, belongs to an Iberian or Mediterranean inflection of white, even if, following home, we allowed the term as accurate to describe the color of Southern Europeans' tales of distinctions. Horta similarly notes that the categories of Portuguese or white are not clear. Zararo's slave market presents the possibility of a somatic link between slave traders and slaves, between conquistadorial explorers and human booty. African darkness, Zararo implies, is not all that different from Portuguese whiteness. This darkness becomes uncomfortably proximate through the racial intermediary, the brown Pardo captive, who is neither entirely white nor entirely black. Brown is at once a color originating from Africa, such as the light-skinned Azenege Moors, as it is also one produced by expansion and the offspring of white Europeans and black Africans. Later, the most emblematic figure of this mixing in the culture of colonization is the child produced by the Lancado, or the European who married indigenous women and lived in Africa. Pay close attention to this. The children of such unions were often referred to as mulattoes. Silva maintains that, as opposed to the other European colonial practices, Portuguese colonists did not forcefully exclude or condemn interracial sex. Mulatto as a designation for someone with brown skin may in itself be pejorative if we accept the etymology of the word as a term originally used for a mule. In Zararo, the brown-skinned African, either the mulatto or the light-skinned native, is a third racial term that upsets the black-white opposition and notionally connects explorers to their captives. Zararo's description of the skin color of the captives admits this connection at the same time that it attempts to isolate brownness as a separate or discrete pigmentational category. Brownness in this taxonomic perspective functions as a buffer zone between white and black and allows a racial hierarchy to remain in place, however temporarily. The brown third term as a color that threatens to loosen the black-white distinction and construe Southern European whiteness relationally rather than absolutely precipitates Zararo's recourse to the aesthetics as an arbiter or moral categories if the fact of whiteness in itself is not corroborated by the natural world as an innate marker of European superiority. Then an aesthetical moral reading of the hues of humankind revealed by Africa rescues the European's natural authority over the African. Alright, I'm going to summarize everything I just read real quick. And from what I got from this particular source, the Portuguese were the first to actually start using the word Guinea to refer to these certain areas and locations, right? They were the first to refer to the darker skinned Africans living in those regions as Guineas as well. On page 23, it reiterates that the concept of race was always a creation of the European as an artificial construct with the only purpose is to classify human beings into a hierarchy of social status and has no basis in reality, nor is race a biological reality. On page 24, he says that Iberian whiteness is not necessarily English or French whiteness, which further illustrates the confusion of what a white person truly is. And he speaks about how there are so-called varying levels of whiteness due to the centuries of Moors marrying and procreating with Europeans and creating darker-skinned Europeans in Southern Europe who are well aware that they are mixed with the blood of Moors. I'm saying they are the result of Moors like Othello being in Europe for centuries. Zerara in the Portuguese use the words negro, moro negro, which is black Moor or blackamoor if translated into English, of course, and the word Guinea all as synonyms to refer to the darker skinned Moors. And Zerara says that there is also another kind of Moor who are lighter skinned and known as the Azanage. Remember them? So what I'm seeing again is that the Europeans are the first to make these distinctions between the darker skinned and lighter skinned Moors. On page 27, Josiah Blackmore says the Moors, black Africans, Ethiopians, and Guineans are like monsters who function like geographical boundaries to the European and separates the European from the known and the unknown parts of Africa. Zerara mentions that in the slave markets there are slaves who could possibly be classified as whites, slaves who were less white, such as mulattoes, and slaves who were classified as blacks, and also that the Europeans had a fear of blackness, or what we erroneously call black, right? On page 29, he speaks about the brown or Pardo Moors who are neither black or white, and that the brown Moors are either indigenous Africans, who were already brown from the start, or the offspring of indigenous Africans procreating with Lancados, who are Europeans. And if you do your research on what a Lancado is, they basically were the Europeans who grafted or implanted themselves into African nations by marrying indigenous women, and Tangomas, who were completely Africanized and grafted into the cultures, and Luso-Africans, who were the children of Lancados and indigenous women. The author mentions that the term mulatto was also used to refer to these children, the Pardos, and that the term mulatto was originally used for a mule, which is the offspring of a male donkey and a female horse. He also mentions that this third racial category of mulatto disrupts the opposition between black and white. I'm going to be reading one more source from Josiah Blackmore, and keep in mind everything I just read from Mooring's Portuguese expansion in the writing of Africa. I'm going to read from Josiah Blackmore's Imaging the Moor, page 29. While the name Mauritania meant properly the former Roman provinces Mauritania, Caesarensis, and Mauritania Tigentanus, corresponding to the present western Algeria and northeastern Morocco, Latin writers sometimes used it not only to cover all North Africa but also the whole of the African continent, as far as the equator, beyond which geographical knowledge did not then extend. Pay attention. From this it followed that there were black as well as white Maori or Moors. Alright, so remember everything I just read from Mooring's Portuguese expansion in the writing of Africa, and everything I just covered in part 1 about race and social status. I'm saying if you've been following along, you will realize that there is no such thing as a white Moor or Arab, nor is there such a thing as a black Moor or a black Arab, simply because there is no such thing as a black or white person to begin with. These are simply the Europeans' attempts to make distinctions between those who are darker skinned and indigenous and those who have various levels of admixture. These so-called white Moors and Arabs are in reality people who are quote-unquote biracial, mulattoes, quadroons, octoroons, and quintroons. I'm saying these are not pure-blooded Europeans. They are the result of centuries and centuries of indigenous Moors of Africa and the so-called Middle East procreating with Europeans. They are the result of centuries of mulattoes mating with darker-skinned Moors, mulattoes mating with octoroons, mulattoes mating with quadroons, mulattoes mating with quintroons, quintroons mating with darker skinned Moors, quintroons mating with octoroons, and all of the other possibilities and couples of darker skinned indigenous Africans and Arabs mating with people of various levels of admixture. To explain further what I'm saying, I'm going to read from The Living Races of Mankind by Henry Neville from 1902. Turkestan, Bokhara, Siberia, and Persia. The population of this great region is composed of different races so blended together as to produce a type differing in important characteristics from the primary stocks, both Turkey and Iranian. The population is estimated at 5,500,000, of whom Iranians of Persian stock constitute 1/5. Their arable tracts and the cities they built were of old as they are now, the joint home of men belonging to the Turkey and Persian races. For centuries a considerable intermingling of these races has been going on, with the result that the original types have become so much modified as to be hardly distinguishable in the general mass, although some typical features may appear as strongly marked in the individuals of the mixed race as in either Turk or Persian of the purest blood. I'm going to quickly go over these terms that are used to classify so-called mixed race people. You have biracial and mulatto, which is referring to a person who has one parent who is quote-unquote pure black and one parent who is pure white. When a biracial or mulatto person procreates with a pure European, the offspring is called a quadroon. And beyond this point, you will begin having offspring who can so-called pass for white. When a quadroon procreates with a pure European, you get what is called an octoroon. And then when an octoroon procreates with a pure European, you get what is called a quintroon, who will have absolutely no trouble passing for white. You have terms like Melungeon and Pardo, which is referring to people who are quote-unquote triracial, meaning that they have European, African, and Native American ancestry. And then the Spaniards have their own castas or caste systems, which is way too confusing to describe and is almost comical, the amount of terms that they came up with to classify mixed people, like mestizos and castizos and a bunch of other categories. You know what I'm saying? It's insane the amount of terms they came up with. Alright, remember what I said in part 1. Due to the one drop rule and Walter Plecker, people in the U.S. who are biracial, quadroons, octoroons, and quintroons were being classified as blacks, Negroes, and coloreds, and still are to this day. The one drop rule is actually in reverse when it comes to North Africa and the Middle East. People who have any admixture of so-called white, no matter how small the mixture is, they are branded as whites, or even if they, remember, just appear to be Caucasoid like the Somalians, they are branded as whites. So it's the exact opposite than what's going on in the U.S. Going back to the video series, The Egyptians Were Burnt Caucasians by Lashid For You, she also spoke about these contradictions also. This is simply the European trying to mark his territory as usual, to claim ancient Egypt and the cultures of the Middle East like Persia and Babylonia, who were all original peoples. To reiterate the subjects of Lancados and Europeans marrying into indigenous cultures, Asir the Ducateers has spoken about this many times. People need to understand that those so-called white Arabs and North Africans are actually biracial, quadroons, octoroons, and quintroons. The reason why they are being branded as whites is so that the European can graft himself into the lineage and bloodline, therefore claiming the ancient cultures in the land as being Caucasoid. By marrying and mating with the original peoples of the land and having offspring such as the Luso-Africans, the European essentially binds himself to the land. The European has done this to the Americas, of course, Australia, etc. You can watch the movie Rabbit Proof Fences when they talk about mating with the Australian Aborigines to turn them quote-unquote white. This is, of course, a method of colonization. The European physically colonizes the land by force, they colonize the mind through indoctrination, and they colonize both by grafting themselves into the lineage, and oftentimes royal lineages, thereby claiming royal lineage and inheritance to the land. You have these, correct me if I'm wrong, what you would call amalgamated Moors, who are quintroons, attempting to claim that they were in North Africa for tens of thousands of years. The people who are being branded as white Berbers and Arabs. Look up the word Bilad al-Barbar, which was an ancient name for Somalia, and there's even a city still named Berbera in Somalia. The original Moors, Arabs, and Berbers were all original dark-skinned peoples. And the only reason why these extremely bleached quintroons can claim to be Berbers or Moors is because they are amalgamated and are the offspring of the original Moors and Berbers and Europeans. Take the time to really examine what the people of North Africa and the Middle East look like. Many of those people who are being branded as whites are, like I said, different levels of a mixture. And if they were born in the U.S. with our one drop rule, a lot of those people would be identified as blacks and African Americans, and also vice versa. We all personally know people who are mixed race, right? Think of all the mixed people who you know. So those people would be branded as whites and Caucasians if they lived in North Africa. I've actually met a few octoroons and quintroons or quadroons who actually identify themselves as being blacks, and people who could pass for white, yet they identify themselves as blacks. What's his name? Vin Diesel has been quoted saying that he identifies himself as being a man of color. I can think of 3 people in the Black Power movement who would be classified as white if they were born in Africa. What's her name? Kathleen Cleaver is one of those people who was part of the Black Panther movement, and she was married to Eldridge Cleaver. I'm saying, take a good look at this woman and what she looks like. There's absolutely no way she would be able to pass for so-called black if she was born in Africa under those systems of social hierarchy. You know what I'm saying? She would be branded as white and Caucasoid, just like the rest of those so-called mixed race people and white Arabs. 2 more individuals who are so delusional that they actually believe they would fit in with the black Africans, the so-called black Africans, is Sarah Seti and this guy who calls himself Dr. Reggie. Right? Seti and Reggie had convinced themselves that they are the same people as these West Africans and the indigenous unmixed Africans, talking about they black African power and all this other nonsense. And these dudes don't even realize they would be classified as whites and would be living amongst these so-called white peckerwood, low life the Arabs they love talking about so much. You know what I'm saying? Someone remind these dudes to look in the mirror, because they would never fit into West African culture looking the way they do, all bleached up and pale. You know what I'm saying? These dudes need to stop fooling themselves into believing they are real Africans when they are nothing more than fake Africans. I hope I simplify the subject of classifying mixed race people as much as possible. The subject of race will always be very confusing. You know what I'm saying? Just realize that there is no such thing as a white Moor or a white Arab, nor is there such a thing as a black Moor or a black Arab. There are Moors who are original and indigenous. There are Moors with varying levels of a mixture. Then there are amalgamated Moors, Moors and Arabs who have very little indigenous or original genetics left in them. With that, I'm going to end part 2, and in part 3, I'm going to discuss the true definition of black and the basic psychology of why people still use that word. And thanks for watching. Peace.